This is an IWP media production brought to you by the Institute of World Politics, the independent accredited graduate school empowering the next generation of national security, intelligence, and international affairs experts. Learn from top scholar practitioners and acquire invaluable skills to propel your career. For more information, visit iwp.edu/apply.
Welcome to the IWP podcast, coming to you live from the Institute of World Politics here in Washington, D.C. I am your host, Jim Robbins, Dean of Academics at IWP. Our guest today is Professor John Quattrocki. John has a distinguished background in the FBI, DNI, the NSC, and in the private sector, as well as being one of the most popular IWP professors for 13 years. John, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Jim.
Our topic today is one that's near and dear to your heart, which is counterintelligence.
Right.
And, people in the audience may be familiar with the difference between intelligence and counterintelligence, or maybe not, but why don't you contextualize it for us?
Okay. Thanks, and thanks to WP for sponsoring this. This actually has pretty long legs. We had started this, as you might or might not be aware, 2 years ago. In 2022, there were three things going on that I got pulled into kind of independently, but all at the end of the day joining at the same point. There had been a book written called The Fourth Man, which suggested that we in the counterintelligence and counterespionage community, which aren't necessarily the same, had perhaps missed something in the 90s and into the 2000s. And so somebody had written a book that took a stab at who we might have missed and who might still be out there. I'm mentioned in the book. I also worked those cases. So a few people reach out to me about the impending publication of that book. At the same time, we were at the 20th anniversary of the National Counterintelligence Enhancement Act of 2002. And that's where the Congress had picked up on President Clinton's last PDD in office, PDD 75, and it created the first time ever role of the presidentially appointed, Senate-confirmed position of the National Counterintelligence Executive. So we had hired the first NCX on my watch when I was the director of counterintelligence for the White House on the National Security Council staff. So people were reaching out to me like 20 years later, let's look back on the last 20 years. Have you wound up where you wanted to wind up? Is it somewhere different than we planned to be? At the same time, unbeknownst to us originally, but then abundantly clear to us after the fact, the SISI was also looking at the exact same thing. So the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, which has its roots in counterintelligence as a product of the Church Committee hearings back in 75 and 76, the SISI was doing a review, its own independent review of where was the NCIX and counterintelligence after 20 years of the Counterintelligence Enhancement Act. So I started looking at this 20 years ago. I still do some private consulting when I'm away from school. So with those three vectors kind of in play, swirling around our classes that we teach here and some consulting services I was providing, I thought I'd start to write a book. So I'm now in the process of doing just that. Not about cases, not about operations, but about the history of policy development of counterintelligence. And it's something for which a few number of us have kind of a unique privileged perspective. When I was at the White House on the NSC staff, the original impulse to this began in 2001, which we'll get into in a bit. We know I've discussed that. That effort ran for about 2 years, and we rolled it into a subsequent effort that was established by executive order in 2004. We published in 2005. There's a classified version, but there's also a very fulsome, not unclassified, not declassified, but an unclassified version, which is available to anybody who wants to look it up, under Executive Order 13328 or the Silberman-Robb Commission. So over the last 2 years here at school and among some of my other clients and talking out there in the community, we just felt like it was time to take a look with 20 years in the books at where were we, how did we get to where we were 20 years ago, and where are we going from here?
John, given the dates of these reviews, it would be easy to jump to the conclusion that they were another of the post-9/11 looks at U.S. intelligence and the larger national security framework. But that's not quite accurate, is it?
Not quite, right. One would think that, and they could be forgiven that. It's understandable. In fact, the story about the counterintelligence piece of this, so not the counterterrorism piece, and not the larger national security framework or foreign intelligence collection piece, but the specific counterintelligence piece actually begins in the summer of 2000. And in the summer of 2000, an election year, when not many things get done in this sleepy town, by design, right? We call it the silly season for a reason. Incumbent administrations don't want any news on the front page because it's usually bad. And so there's a tendency to kind of lie low with most things in the intelligence world until after the election. But for us, in the summer of 2000, there were a couple of vectors that were kind of meeting at a nodal point in terms of CI. At that point, we had arrested 5 FBI agents and or CIA case officers for espionage on behalf of the Soviets, qua the Russians after 91 and 93. At the same time, we had the Cox report come out, which had documented the complete compromise of our then current nuclear capability to the Chinese by means of what they call affectionately the 95 walk-in, wherein a Chinese national walked into a station overseas and gave us our whole nuclear weapons program back to us, by which we then opened up a series of investigations across the CI community and specifically at DOE. And in 99, we had identified a then SVR, former KGB officer, who had apparently found a way to compromise about 300 feet from the front door of the Secretary of State, the Sec State's conference room, with a technical compromise wherein we guess they had probably made at least 3 covert entries into Foggy Bottom to place a microphone, and they were routinely querying it electronically from a park bench near GW. So we'd had 3 FBI agents, a couple of case officers, a couple of unexplained losses at the more grand national security level. And so by the summer of 2000, there was a little bit of concern that perhaps the Cold War drawdown in our counterintelligence resources had perhaps left us either shorthanded, right, because there had been, as everybody knows, the infamous peace dividend to come after the wall comes down and the Soviet Union breaks up, or perhaps a shift in our resources. Not an unwarranted guess, I would say, right? In the space of about 5 years, we had opened more espionage cases in the wake of Rick Ames' arrest in '94 than we had at any time since the Venona cases of the late 40s and early 50s. From 1955 to 1981, we made fewer arrests for espionage than we made in 1985 alone. So over a decade and a half, we made fewer arrests for espionage than we did in one single year during what we consider to be the heyday or the golden era of counter-espionage. So by the summer of 2000, there was a sense that the drawdown on resources, which had been considerable after fiscal year '93, and perhaps a re-emphasis of our counter-espionage program to the lessening of effort with regard to our double agent program, our recruitment operations, the other corners of counterintelligence, which is not just counter-espionage. Maybe that had left us in need of a realignment. So we instituted something called CI-21, Counterintelligence for the 21st Century, and we wrote a draft of a new presidential decision directive for President Clinton to sign, PDD 75, which would put through the NSC in front of the White House. But there it sat, again, because of the election year. The first week of December of 2000. So recall, this is the 2000 election cycle. So it's Chad delayed, right? We don't have a determination because the Supreme Court's weighing in on Florida and the Chads. For us in the intelligence community, one of the implications there was that a lot of the final debriefings to the incoming Bush administration team were being delayed because we didn't know who was going to be the president. So that would go until the end of November. At the same time, the U.S. government was at the end of a 2.5 year investigation of a CIA officer we had come to believe had fallen out of the subsequent investigation of the After Ames environment and the cases we had conducted then. So, in the wake of Ames, despite our most fervent wishes that Ames had been responsible for all the compromises we had identified, when we got to the end of a debriefing session with Ames through the summer of '94, we had arrested him on February 21st of '94, and then a series of debriefings accompanied by polygraphs, it was clear Ames was likely telling the truth. But unfortunately, in telling the truth, it was clear we still had a series of compromises that could not be explained by Ames alone. So then we endeavored to open a series of cases to find possible other compromises. When we got to the end of November of the election year of 2000, we still had a case open on a singular individual we had focused on who was then employed at the CIA. At the same time, the CIA and select special agents within the Bureau had done an extraordinary piece of work of cultivating a source of information who comes into us the first week of December of 2000 and hands us the information by which we realize not only do we not have the right subject, we actually know who the right subject is, and it's Bob Hansen. So the first week of December of 2000, we come off of a 2.5 year investigation into a CIA officer. We refocus the investigation on Bob Hansen. We arrest him on February 18th of 2001. And with that, the incoming administration, seeing the compromise with the 95 walk-in and our nuclear arms information, still unsolved. The ongoing investigation into the compromise of the State Department is still unsolved. And the made in good faith, well-intended, but ultimately misdirected espionage case against a CIA officer when it had, in fact, had been an FBI agent. The incoming administration had decided that perhaps it was time for a de novo look of all of what we were doing in counterintelligence. But they were beaten to the gun by President Clinton, having written PDD 24, Presidential Decision Directive 24, in May of 1994 after the arrest of Ames. He now turns 9 days before the inauguration in 2001 and writes PDD 75. PDD 75 seeks to, again, make more effective our application of counterintelligence, and by more effective, I mean more efficient, because we weren't getting more resources. So they're trying to reorganize the way in which we went about business. And the way to do that, in the president's mind, President Clinton's mind, was to establish the office of the National Counterintelligence Executive, which he does by presidential directive, which, as you know, despite the advantages of directives and orders, they don't have the same lasting effect as legislation. Right. And so the Congress, in a spirit of genuine good government, turns to the president's PDD and starts to draft legislation that will capture the president's intention in the PDD, but lay the legislative imprimatur over the top of it so that it's got long legs that can survive changes in administration. Into that environment comes the new administration and President Bush. And so President Bush, on May 8th, 2001, so 2.5 months after his inauguration, and it's important to note in all these conversations, but a good 4 months before 9/11. So this is all pre-9/11 impulse, and that point cannot be emphasized enough. So to your point earlier, and the question that got us here is, one would think this is a product of the 9/11 environment. It was not. It was a product of a completely different set of vectors going all the way back to the 1980s and carrying forward to the months just prior to 9/11. President Bush signs NSPD 5. President Clinton, as a term of art, called his directives presidential decision directives. President Bush, as is every president's wont, changes it slightly. He calls his NSPDs, or National Security Presidential Directives. And he writes a very succinct page-and-a-half directive, NSPD 5, that directs the DCI. Now, of course, we have the DNI, but then there was the role of the DCI. It was George 10 at the time. And if I remember the wording correctly, if not verbatim, the president gave George Tenet a broad mandate to review U.S. intelligence and with it U.S. counterintelligence, specifically called out, and make such recommendations as such that they would bring intelligence and counterintelligence in line with 21st century traditional threats, but also address 21st century emerging threats. And there it sat. The original directive envisioned an external and an internal panel. Generally in this town, you know the president's serious when he creates an external panel, because those are people that don't have to worry about their government supervisor when they write something. They don't have to worry about their next paycheck. They're very independently oriented, and it's a great check on the work we do and a kind of arm's reach look at our independent results, hopefully. So there's an independent and an independent external and an independent-ish internal panel created, and we set about the work in May, June, and July of 2001. Again, it's immediately after the election. It's been a long, difficult election for everybody. We're still in the process at the time of vetting department heads up on the Hill that require Senate confirmation. And you look back on this now and you think of the historical element of it. We had set for ourselves a mid-September 2001 date to come back with some of our initial notions about the way forward. How would we do the review? What would we look at? What wouldn't we look at? What was our end product going to look like? So we were very much in the drafting phase around NSPD 5 in the summer of 2001, and we agreed to come back in the middle of September of 2001 and blaze the way forward. Well, of course, in between those two events is 9/11. And 9/11 has the net effect then of collapsing all the manpower previously available to us for this good faith look at the intelligence and counterintelligence community, and it's an all hands on deck environment. So everybody that we had envisioned, all the seniors and all the gray beards that we're going to lean into for the external and internal panel, are suddenly now otherwise assigned, right? They're working op centers, they're at undisclosed locations, they're working on other efforts with the Hill to look at what is now the emerging and current topic, which is terrorism and counterterrorism. So we brought the whole NSPD 5 effort back into the White House, and then we ran it internally from the National Security Council staff. And I got the piece with counterintelligence. And other parts of it we segmented out through the NSC, but I kept the piece on counterintelligence and worked on that. I suspect the president's expectations were that we'd get something done within 180 days, 6 months or so. But deprived of manpower and everybody else pulling double duty on a bunch of other topics, it would be almost 2 years before we actually came to at least a series of draft observations and conclusions about the way forward. So Veterans Day of 2003, we have a meeting at the White House. And now we realize this has gotten a little long in the tooth. It was never afforded the manpower, analysis, research, writing, that we had originally envisioned under the directive. So we conclude the work on the PD, and we take that work and we roll it into a draft or imagined executive order by President Bush in February of 2004. So Executive Order 13328 creates the Silberman-Robb Commission. And the Silberman-Robb Commission is a truly bipartisan presidential commission, 6 Democrats, 6 Republicans, established to take a hard look at what had we missed with the weapons of mass destruction, what did that tell us about the state of our intelligence community, and we rolled the NSPD 5 piece about counterintelligence into it, and so we looked at, in chapters 10 and 11, the counterintelligence piece too.
So would you say there was an advantage to the delay that happened because of 9/11?
Well, there was no delay to me personally. It was a back-breaking schedule to work, but there was an extraordinary delay to the effort, right? Because we got the chance So one of the things come out of out of the 9/11 attacks, where we took so many of our existing national security bodies and slewed them towards terrorism, that it kind of cleared the decks for a hard look at counterintelligence without much going on. We had arrested Hansen. We were in the process of debriefing him. I think he made his plea in July of 2001, so again, 2 months before 9/11. We're in the process of debriefing him through the 9/11 attacks, and nobody was pressuring us to come out with results quickly on the CI piece because the CT piece had dominated everything. I had FISA orders sitting with the FISA court on counterintelligence matters. Everything gets pushed to the side to make room for counterterrorism. And this is the part that kind of comes out in studies like this, and when you make presentations even to a well-informed public. At the end of the day, as deep as the pockets are in the U.S. intelligence community and the counterintelligence community, they are not infinitely deep. And so you do have bandwidth or capability issues because you have to slew resources from one topic of the day to another topic of the day, and sometimes you have to do it in the space of hours, like on the morning of 9/11. You'll take all your CI bodies and slide them to CT for a while because that has become the new imminent danger to be addressed by the larger intelligence community. So, but for us, it gave us a chance to take a deep breath, avail ourselves of the Hansen debriefings, which will come to bear significantly on a number of issues, but principally the double agent program. And in doing our interviews to support first the NSPD-5 effort and then the EO 13328 effort, it gave the people we were speaking to, and we were given wide berth to interview whomever in government we needed to interview. I camped over at OMB for a while just asking about funding levels and basic stuff about training modules, but we also spent time with the investigators and the operators about what do your operations look like globally, from what do your cases, your investigations suffer, what do they benefit from, how can we make that better if we can, where have we gone since the end of the Cold War, do we need to be in a different place than that? So in a sense, as horrible as 9/11 was, and it was, the collateral effect of delaying this look, I think, resulted to the benefit at least of the CI community.
What were the draft observations and conclusions of the NSPD-5 review?
So we organized, or we triaged our observations into rough buckets. So we had a principal bucket, a secondary bucket, and a tertiary bucket. In the principal bucket, we were pretty confident that there were 8 issues we'd identified that would probably have to be addressed by the new NCIX. And before I give those to you, let me give you a little bit of history of CI writ larger. I'm not going to go back to the Civil War or the Revolutionary War, but I think it does help the listener, the student, the policymaker, to understand that the first thing to come out of both of these review efforts, NSPD-5 and EO 13328, was the fact that among the senior policymakers in all of U.S. government, there was no consensus on what counterintelligence meant. You could talk to senior policymakers about air power, you could talk to them about sea power, you could talk to them about the main battle tank and it being the pointy end of the spear in terms of the U.S. Army. There were a lot of issues in national security that get some disagreements on the margins, but at its core, there's very little disagreement about the statecraft of certain national security organs. Counterintelligence, not so much. Everybody we talked to wanted to talk to us. Nobody told us they wouldn't. Nobody needed the suasion of the Oval Office to make them talk to us. People were eager. In their eagerness, though, what we determined was, with regard to counterintelligence specifically, there was a fair amount of certainty about how one senior misunderstood counterintelligence from another senior. I think in its most benign construction, I had one undersecretary tell me, I don't know, it's whatever the Bureau tells me it is. So there was, the long shadow of J. Edgar Hoover. In many people's minds, CI was owned by the Bureau. Not true, but an understandable misunderstanding. And so they would just wait for the Bureau to tell them what they need to think about counterintelligence. But for most of the other seniors, there were some that were convinced it was an extension of the security community. And they would dig in on that you have you have the 5 families of security. So you've got OPSEC, operational security, SysSec, system security on the information system, InfoSec itself, SigSec for your SIGINT capabilities, PERSEC for your personnel. Yeah. So there's a family of security practices, and many of the people in government at the time saw counterintelligence as kind of the cherry on the top of the security community. That the role of counterintelligence was to apply that last counterespionage piece whereby we arrest people for stealing secrets. And that became kind of prevalent. It's not true. There was a different definition of counterintelligence, which will feed into, and we've discussed this in the past, the romanticization of the MI5 model. And we saw a lot of that in talking to people. Well, we should do the way MI5 does it. And we'd say, okay, well, how does MI5 do it? And, well, I don't know, but that's the way we should do it, right? But this all feeds into that romance, and understandably, however incorrectly. These are all assertions made in very good faith. So,
is that like the Angleton legacy?
So there's a little bit of that, but more fundamentally, it goes to the notion that for many, especially after 9/11, right, because now we're 2 and 3 years after 9/11, that for many, counterintelligence and counterespionage are synonymous. In other words, you say counterintelligence, I hear arrest spies. You say counterintelligence, I hear protect secrets. Well, protect is an objective of the security community, right? In the same way, if you were to go out to a CIA officer at CIA and say, what is your job? He or she would say, my job is to run secure operations in the field, keep my sources alive, and get the information to Langley. True enough. In the same way, if I were to go to a fighter pilot, I'd say, what's your job? Kill the guy in front of me. I'm in a plane, he's in a plane, kill the guy in front of me. But at the same time, if you were to go to the director of CIA, Bill Burns today, right, or the Secretary of the Air Force and say, what's your job? They would not turn around and say, my job is to make sure that fighter pilot kills the guy in front of him. Or my job is to make sure that CIA officer runs a secure operation on the ground in fill in the blank, whatever station or base. Director Burns would say, my job is to provide the President of the United States with intelligence that is timely and free of hostile control or influence such that he has an advantage strategically against this third party or state-sponsored engagee or that third party or state-sponsored engagee. The role of the missions is very different. The statecraft role of the missions is very different than the tradecraft role of the individuals executing on the ground, right? So
tactical, operational,
absolutely.
Strategic, yes.
And the military's pretty good at this, right? They've got a 70-year doctrine around the supported and supporting elements, and they all understand that as mission rolls up, it rolls up differently. The job of the Secretary of the Air Force is not to protect the job of fighter pilots and the white silk scarf union, right? His job is to provide air dominance for the president so the president can wage war and exert advantage over an adversary. Burns' job is to make sure that the President of the United States has intelligence sooner and more reliably than the next guy so that he can make better decisions in the interest of the national security. So if that's the job of the intelligence community, and counterintelligence by itself by its very term being a derivative function, we are countering, our job isn't to support CIA as much as it is to counter the CIA equivalent on the other side of the table. So if the role of the other intelligence service, say the SVR, is to get President Putin information in a timely enough fashion and free of hostile control or influence such that he can outguess President Zelensky, outguess President Bush, outguess the prime ministers of the NATO countries, if that's his job, then one should, and we did at one time in our lives, in our careers, Counterintelligence isn't so much about stopping spying. It's about making the information they collect through their inevitable successes untimely and unreliable. And you can't do that by just stopping spying. And the problem is doubled down on, and this is the part when we interview the seniors within the intelligence community and the larger national security framework, we'd say, look, but let's go for the moment, because we always encourage, like if you think we're wrong, we're the ones doing the research and the interview and writing the draft, but if you think we're wrong, come back at us and tell us how that would look. And in almost every case, when we asked them, if the role of the counterintelligence community, Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine Corps, FBI, CIA, if the job is to prevent spying, that is to sit atop the security elements and provide that last little piece that protects our secrets, what does that look like on the ground? Tell me what that looks like. And inevitably, they would know that there were, and are, as we speak right now, up the street from school here, there's 28,000 accredited diplomats in the United States. 28,000. Right? We're the only country in the world that has 2 full-time ambassadorial staffs for almost every country on the planet. Right? Every country, almost every country, has an embassy here in Washington with a full ambassadorial staff. So the Russian ambassador to the United States is different than the Russian ambassador to the mission up in New York at the UN. Full-time ambassadorial staff. There's also 22 American cities that play host to a national press agency, a consular office, some other kind of sovereign establishment that affords diplomatic immunity to the diplomats and or intelligence officers working there. So if you've got 28,000 diplomats working with diplomatic immunity out of sovereign establishments, assume only even 5% of them are actually intelligence officers. Right? You're talking about 1,400 intelligence officers. Now, when I got promoted back to headquarters, I took over responsibility for the supervision of the espionage program at FBI headquarters. And one of those cases was Ames. So this was a fantastic FBI agent by the name of Mike Rochford who had headquarters supervision during the investigation. I got there after the arrest, but during the debriefings and the after action, the damage assessment. And so in a very clever way, Mike let it fall to me that I had to write the letters of commendation for everybody that had worked the Ames case. So I wrote 323 letters of commendation on the Ames case. And back then, the Bureau was the old Bureau, and you actually had to write each one out individually. We didn't, like 94, we were barely automated, and so you're writing them out individually. But take that number, 350 employees, and multiply it by your 1,400 case officers.
Right.
You literally don't have the resources to work counterintelligence as counterespionage only, if that's how you're keeping score.
Right, and that 1,400 doesn't even include their agent networks.
There you go. It doesn't include, those are just the intelligence officers, right? Doesn't include the TD wires, doesn't include the illegals network. That's just the formal declared diplomatic presence providing cover to an otherwise fully trained intelligence officer working for fill in the blank, the SVR, the MSS, whomever, right? So no matter how you hold it up, red team or blue team, however you hold it up to the light, counterintelligence as counterespionage doesn't work very effectively. Now, I say that, biting the hand feeds me, because my career in the Bureau was made principally arresting spies, and it's been very good to me, and I am forever indebted, you know. But men and women much wiser than I that preceded me in the counterintelligence enterprise in the Bureau realized if you're going to grade us by catching all the spies and protecting all the information, we're all going to fail. That can't happen. Doesn't have to happen, actually. And that's where the role of double agents comes in, right? So recall one of the great spies, if not the greatest spy of the 20th century, was Richard Sorge. Richard Sorge tells Stalin, by dint of working in East Asia, in the Asian community, not for the Soviets, obviously, because he's a Soviet spy, but in the German community in East Asia, he gets wind through a German officer contact that Hitler is going to break Molotov-Ribbentrop and invade the Soviet Union. Right at this point, the Soviet Union's a non-belligerent during World War II, right? Sorga reports that to Stalin. Stalin thinks either Sorga's been doubled and is giving him false information, or Sorga's running somebody who's been doubled and it's all false information, and he doesn't act on it. And he gets surprised by Barbarossa in June of 41, okay? Similarly, it happened with the Israelis during the 73 war. They had information. They didn't believe it. They believed it had been provided through a double agent operation. Just one of the inherent advantages of seeing counterintelligence as more than espionage is if you see it as deception, the other guy starts to see it as deception, and we'll also start to see it even where it's not there, right? Best example in our most recent history or memory would be Rick Ames. Rick Ames walks up the street here to the Soviet embassy in April of '85. And what do? They send him away for 30 days. Arguably the greatest spy to walk in their front door and volunteer himself, but since they hadn't recruited him, he volunteers himself. They think he must be a double.
Right.
So they send him away for 30 days. Imagine he gets struck by lightning, hit by a bus, changes his mind. They send away one of the greatest sources ever, right? They send him away. The fact of doubles outside the United States is more of an embedded part of your larger counterintelligence program than it is here in the United States. In the United States, and I blame one of our old professors here, Ken de Graffenried, because he had the original draft pen on Executive Order 12333, December of 1981. And in it, it says on page 1 in the preamble, above part 1, it says special emphasis will be given to the detection of espionage. So with the president's one-line paragraph telling the Bureau, you will now turn to counterespionage, we did, and we did to great effect, right? 83, 84, 85, 86, 87, 88. We're having great success in the counterespionage war. But inarguably, counterintelligence is the most manpower-intensive element of all the national security practices. And when you're spending those kinds of resources on espionage cases, you're going to necessarily have to pull away from other things.
Right. Let's talk about some of those other things. For example, offensive counterintelligence. People may not even be aware that exists.
So I'm glad you brought that up. Yeah, and
one of my favorites.
Well, and we encountered a lot of that in our initial interviews, both in May, June, July. So through 01, 02, and 03, I encountered a lot of that when we were talking to people. And just for the record here, we didn't talk to just Americans. We talked to a lot of our allies. We flew them in very privately and interviewed them. What are you seeing out there? How is it you do business? Does your model, do you think, map to our model well? Does our model map? So it's not nearly as black and white as people like to make it. You know, we do it poorly, they do it well, or vice versa. There was a lot of give and take. But I would say among U.S. policymakers, the single most disputed piece was what you just brought up. Many of the senior policymakers inside the Department of Justice, you know, for whom I worked, although J. Edgar Hoover would say, don't ever say that. We're independent of the Department of Justice. The FBI runs its own. Not true, of course, but that's an old holdover from the Hoover days. People would come back and say, you know, the Bureau's got to work more offensive counterintelligence. And we'd say, okay, fair point. What do you mean by that? Well, you just have to work more. Okay. And we'd say, we're here to work with you. Your words through my pen are going to find a piece of paper for the president's review. Tell me what you mean by that. And after a little bit of horse trading, intellectual horse trading over a series of weeks and then into months, it's clear what they meant was you have to work your counter-espionage piece more aggressively and more globally, which can't be done. So when you say offensive or strategic counterintelligence, that's what they were saying. What they meant was you have to work your counter-espionage piece more aggressively and more globally. So again, they were making the same mistake we were encountering from day one, which is counterintelligence qua counter-espionage. And they had to do that better. The reality is the FBI works its counterintelligence mission as aggressively as you possibly can. And what do I mean by that? Recall earlier we said there's 28,000 diplomats. On average, a third of them are leaving right now. So we're in the beginning of July right now, right, as we record this. So from June to August, a third leave and they're replaced by a third. Why? Because all diplomats and intelligence officers have kids, and they want to get their kids out of school after the last semester ends and into school before the next. So Dulles, San Francisco International, LAX, O'Hare, all these airports right now are filled with diplomats. A third of them are leaving, and they're being replaced in that third. Why? Because the normal diplomatic/intelligence officer tour is about 3 years for the CIA, for the State Department, for MFAs around the world. So when a third comes in, that third is bringing with them cover for the very, very, very small piece that's an intelligence officer. Remember, 20 minutes ago we said, let's say 5%. That's not the real number. We actually know what the real number is, but let's just say that for the purpose of this conversation. That larger diplomatic community is providing the haystack, if you will, for the intelligence needle embedded within. So when we in the Bureau have to look for the new intelligence officers, we have to sift through all the hay to find that needle, which means we have to open cases on all the diplomats, but not because we're working the diplomats to recruit them, but to get through them to determine which of you are in fact diplomats and which of you are intelligence officers. And generally, we're given a year by the Department of Justice to do that. So they come in, State Department notifies us of a visa, we meet them, we surveil them, we listen to them otherwise, we contact their contacts, we send people to talk to them, and we take about a year to determine, in fact, are you the second secretary for political military affairs, or are you an intelligence officer? And after a year, we make a good faith determination. They're in fact a real diplomat, not of real interest to the FBI. They're in fact a real intelligence officer of extraordinary interest to the FBI. So we have to plow through all of that every year to get them for the last 2 years of their tour into a status where we have the draw on the resources, FISA, physical surveillance, a network of human assets to work against them, to take a run at them, to recruit them. Because recruiting them or finding out with whom they're in contact will help us fill the other three corners of the three-cornered counterintelligence hat, which is penetrations, double agents, and arrests for espionage. But counterintelligence operations are very different than counterespionage investigation. Different set of rules, different laws and policies, different mode of doing business.
When you talk about turning people, which I know is always the objective, and people see on TV or in a show something about a double agent or a triple agent or something like that. But how would you define it? How would you discuss that concept?
Yeah, so I don't know if you and I discussed that previously, but it's an on-point question because it was also one of the more confusing definitions we encountered in talking to the senior representatives of the intelligence community. There was a lot of confusion about when we mentioned the double agent program, which at that point was really on point for us because as we found out later through the debriefing process with Bob Hansen, he had turned over our double agent program, lock, stock, and barrel, which we had not known at the time. So let's distinguish terms here. If we, and by we I mean the FBI or the CIA overseas, if they recruit a member of the Foreign Intelligence Service, so you recruit, country X has a Foreign Intelligence Collection Service, and we recruit that person, right? That's a recruitment. It's not a double agent, right? If that foreign power sends somebody to us for the purpose of recruiting one of ours, and we flip him, we then convert him or her to a double agent. You'll find oftentimes, especially with regard to Hansen and Ames, I just saw something on Hansen 2 weeks ago, referred to Hansen being a double agent. Hansen was not a double agent. He was a fully vetted recruitment in his pseudonym, but a fully vetted recruitment as far as the Soviets could be sure of the Russian intelligence services. That's different than a double agent. Double agents become the big leverage for the counterintelligence community against an otherwise struggling counterespionage program. Because for the ones we miss, right, for as many people as we've arrested for espionage, and the numbers usually surprise people, we've tracked this. We work with PERSEREC out in Monterey. We have our own internal accounting. We've arrested about 208 people for espionage since 1977. A lot, right? Not as many, as I said earlier, in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, because, and there's reasons for that have to do with FISA and wiretaps, which frankly are the long pole in the counter-espionage program, but not the counterintelligence program. So if you can't arrest them all, then job one is to make the ones that slip through the net otherwise unreliable to the head of state running that intelligence service, right? So the double agent thing, the concept of double agents became very confusing in this period of review from 01 to 05. And a lot of the seniors in the best of faith, very well intended, were confused. They had confused the term double agent with a penetration operation with operations of deception run by the CIA for a perception management or active measures purpose. That again is different. Running deception operations to misdirect their policy is different than the counterintelligence community running double agents to protect your sources, right? One is to malignly inform another nation's national security decision-making. The other is to hide your sources. So double agents for a counterintelligence purpose, very different than agents of influence that you're running to malign or otherwise influence operations, right? The policy making of a foreign power. And people say, well, but don't you also do foreign intelligence, and wouldn't you run a double agent for that purpose? I said, no. You know, I had a great career in the Bureau. If you gave me a recruitment of a non-counterintelligence target, say someone with his PhD in physics and was working on some country's nuclear weapons program, and I recruited him, you want me interviewing that person about the fine points of miniaturization of nuclear warheads? In working CI, I'll work the other country's intelligence officer, not their diplomat, right? So going back to our numbers, 28,000 diplomats, most of them, 90, 95% of them, are engaged in whatever they're good at. Maritime treaties, nuclear weapons. There's a whole range of legitimate diplomatic issues for which you need genuine expertise at the pointy end of the spear. Now, for sure, foreign intelligence officers are trying to recruit them, but not the counterintelligence officers. We're looking for the intelligence officer embedded within the diplomatic community and trying to recruit that person. We'll look to hand off the person that turns out to be a legitimate diplomat with an expertise beyond that for which we're trained, and we'll hand that off to a CIA officer so that he or she can debrief them in a more informed, knowledgeable way, right? So again, not only can double agents as a term be confused with penetration, the term double agents itself can be confused between double agents for a counterintelligence purpose and agents of deception for the purpose of perception management and information operations and influence operations. Does that help?
Oh, very clear. And underscores the issue that how hard it is for decision makers to know what to trust, because they can barely comprehend the terminology.
Right.
Let alone the trust matrix.
Right, and going back to your question earlier, you know, the half hour ago, did the delay help us? It did. It did for me being able to write not on a short deadline, got a couple of years to write to the next draft, which then got us to the executive order. There was a disadvantage in this, and it's a small regard, but it's important. By the time we got to 2003 and 2004, the whole government had turned to the GWAT, to the war on terror, right? And they were all oriented on the terrorism target. And so there was a tendency, understandably, to see counterterrorism and counterintelligence think very, very similar. But as somebody at DOJ said to me, counterintelligence and counterterrorism are as similar as lightning and lightning bug.
Right.
In other words,
Not similar at all.
they share a common noun, but other than that, they're not very similar at all, right? So as we progressively, through 02, 03, 04, into 05, as we did these interviews, more and more and more the government was getting inured to the counterterrorism target, and understandably so, which made us querying them on the counterintelligence mission and informing them on the counter progressively more difficult. People are retiring, they're moving on to counterterrorism. Counterterrorism's become their world, and counterintelligence is kind of drifting to the back. So,
yeah. I mean, not to belabor the point, but I mean, it's kind of a fun game to look up how different agencies define the same term.
right.
And
Right.
know that even people using the same term may mean something different
Right.
when you're having those interagency conversations, which
Right.
I'm sure on the NSC you ran into all the time.
We did, and so I started square one on that. I personally went back on that. We looked for all the extant versions, definitions of counterintelligence out there. There is a definition in the original National Security Act of 1947, and it's, by my lights, through a fair amount of research, it's the first time I could find the U.S. government defining counterintelligence. I think prior to 1947, elements within the government had a vested interest in not fully defining it, so counterintelligence became counter-subversion, counter-sabotage, counter-protest, counter a lot of things, and the less defined it was, the wider the aperture was to go after groups and individuals, especially during the two Red Scare periods of the 1920s and then again in the 1940s and 1950s. So there was one working definition of counterintelligence out of the National Security Act of 47, and the Congress had defined it. President Reagan, through the pen of Ken DeGraff and Reed, defines counterintelligence in Executive Order 13328 for the first time. So we actually have a second definition, this by the President's pen and signature in December of 1981. And unfortunately, that definition substantially, predominantly correct, made the mistake of reinforcing, which I guess is to be understood, that subparagraph C on page 1 of detecting and countering espionage, because the original definition in the 81 version of 12333 says counterintelligence is defined as disrupting. It's all the security-related elements, all the counter-espionage-related elements of counterintelligence, and not the strategic or global or offensive piece that you had alluded to a few minutes ago, right? So when we got a chance, at this point I'm at the NCIX, which has rolled now up to the newly created DNI by this point, we got a chance to rewrite the definition on an amended version of 12333, which the listeners should know, it is rare that a president from a different administration will, instead of writing his or his own executive order, will edit the old version and keep the old number. They'll usually upgrade the number, update it. Like I think President Biden is in the 14,000s right now, maybe even the early 15,000s. Executive Order 13328, right, was 12333, so 1,200 or 12,000 series was President Reagan. When President Bush rewrites it in 2008 before he leaves, it's still 12333. So 12333 is still the executive order. He rewrites it, and it's rewritten substantially, but it's still the 12333. So he carries the same number forward. So iconic is
Right.
the instrument, right? But in there, we got a chance to rewrite the definition of counterintelligence. And if one were to look it up now, you'd see it looks similar, not identical. And the first word in the definition is deceive. It's no longer disrupt. It's now put a primacy on double agents and deception before you get to disruption. And in the working group we had to rewrite it, we drafted it, sent it in, redrafted it again. The watchword or the bumper sticker for it became deceive wherever you can and then disrupt only when you must. In other words, the first operation of choice in a global counterintelligence program, a strategic counterintelligence program with offensive capabilities, is to deceive the other head of state into doing the wrong thing at the wrong time or ignoring the right thing at the right time.
Right.
Either way redounds to the benefit of the U.S. national security and the President of the United States, right?
Yes, absolutely.
So that's why we front-loaded the deception piece into Executive Order 12333 in 2008 in the revision.
Excellent. John, looking ahead at sort of the current and emerging critical challenges in counterintelligence, and I'd like to add, by the way, that you will be hosting your own series on this coming up on the IWP network. But looking ahead at these challenges, what do you see as the sort of current controversies, both in terms of the organization of our counterintelligence systems and culture, and also like in specific threats that we have?
So I'd answer that in three flavors, okay? And for the first, I'll draw not from my own words and my own research and the draft manuscript I have, I go home to every night and wake up to every morning. But I'll go ahead and take verbatim the language from the SISI look at this 2 years ago. So in 2021 and 2022, the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, so Chairman Warner and Ranking Minority Member Rubio looked at this. It's one of those rare and appreciated, bipartisan, good faith, collegial looks at a serious national security matter. And they published a report, which is available online. You can go to the Senate webpage. It's there to be downloaded in PDF. And they assessed the NCSC, which is what the NCIX became. So when we hired Michelle Van Cleve as the first NCIX in 2002, she was succeeded by two other NCIXs. And then in 2008, which will get me to one of these conclusions for you, in 2008, they brought the Special Security Service, the SCSC. The DNI used to maintain an office just for security practices. And the DNI sent the Special Security Service over to commingle with the NCX, and then they rebranded it as now the NCSC, the National Security and Counterintelligence Center. NCSC, National Counterintelligence and Security Center. After about 10 years, the SISI, the Senate, decides to look at it. And they concluded that 2 years ago, and they've published a report. And in it, there's a lot of findings. They're offered in good faith, but they're fairly harsh. They say that the counterintelligence community, led by the NCSC, lacks for a definition of counterintelligence and lacks for a definition of the role of the DNI through the NCSC as to how do we conduct offensive, strategic counterintelligence, and how do we distinguish that in terms of manpower, training, mission, however it is you keep score. How do we keep the counterespionage investigative bodies and the counterintelligence operational bodies globally? How do we keep them in the right balance? Not away from each other, but in the right balance. If you have a counterespionage investigative program without a double agent program, you're working with one hand tied behind your back. Similarly, if you have a double agent program and no counterespionage program, you're also working with one hand tied behind your back. One is necessary to the effective execution of the other in both directions. And the Senate came to the conclusion that absent firm guidance and a vision about the way forward from the NCSC, that is from the DNI, that there were changes that need to be made. If we go back to the original premise, the president needs human intelligence to effectively and in a timely fashion conduct national security operations, as does the other guy, whoever the other head of state is. The counterintelligence mission should be able to identify those people feeding that intelligence engine on the other side and make sure it's ineffective and that our president has an advantage. I'm not sure, in my own personal opinion, that doing that through identifying supply chain issues is the right way to go. So citing the language of the NCSC, there's a lot of work to be done. Of course, the wild card for all of us is when we in the White House worked with the Hill on the CI Enhancement Act of 2002, the DNI hadn't been created yet, and DHS had just been created. 20 years later, DHS is the second largest department in the US government. And one could, in good faith, though I might argue you shouldn't, but you could still in good faith argue, perhaps the CI, not the CE, but the CI elements perhaps could be better distributed among the services, the CIA, and perhaps even DHS. I'm sure there's people making that argument, right? More resources, wider aperture to look at. In no way arguing to take the CE piece away from the FBI, but the CE piece is relatively small compared to the larger CI challenges. So I look for an alignment between the global and strategic part of counterintelligence, principally with regard to penetrations and double agents, versus the piece of counterintelligence, counterespionage, that has to remain with the Bureau, has to remain with the Department of Justice. And to the person that asks why, and perhaps you're thinking, why does that have to be? The answer to that is pretty simple. When the Army, and then the Army and the FBI, ran Venona from 1942, it was officially done by 1980. We didn't disclose it till 1995 up at Fort McNair. But when we ran Venona, we probably identified 350 to 370 code-named agents of the KGB, the NKVD in the U.S. government. We only arrested about 11 of them. Most of the names you've heard: Klaus Fuchs, David Greenglass, Harry Gold, Ruth Greenglass, Ethel Rosenberg, Julius Rosenberg, Martin Sobel. We arrested a bunch up front, in addition to one employee from the Department of Justice, a woman by the name of Judith Kaplan. And all of those investigations were driven by wiretaps. But they were wiretaps conducted with a presidential authority signed by President Roosevelt on May 20th of 1940, which means they weren't done by judicial warrant, right? When I was on the criminal side of the house, you'd go to a judge to get a warrant to conduct a Title III wiretap. You come into national security, you go and you get an order from the FISA court to run a probable cause-driven wiretap for a FISA. You can present that in court, and any judge will accept it. If, on the other hand, you conduct a wiretap puncturing the Fourth Amendment protections of the Constitution to an individual, U.S. person, and you do it without warrant, it's hard to get that evidence into court.
Right, but under a national security rationale as opposed to
under a national security rationale, you can do it. You can't get it into court, though. The judge still won't let it into court. And we know this because we actually tried it once. Judith Kaplan was identified through Venona traffic, and we tried to finesse the judge by still getting the case into court. But the judge eventually figured out, you're running a wiretap for which you have no warrant. And so he dismissed the case against Judith Kaplan. And from that point forward, we had no more espionage cases made off of wiretaps until the FISA Act of 1978. So when you look at the dearth of espionage cases through the 50s, 60s, 70s, it's because we had lots going on the counterintelligence side, but we couldn't then turn it into counterespionage investigations because you couldn't survive the public disclosure in court. So not coincidentally, that's when a lot of our espionage cases were then turned over into double agent operations. If you couldn't take them to court, then you were freed up to use them for another purpose.
Yes.
Right? But that all changes in 78 when the Congress gives us the FISA law, and we're able to make a lot of espionage cases. But now that becomes a first option because of the executive order. So they're all interconnected, and they're all fascinating, and there is this notion that everybody's acting in bad faith, starting with Hoover. None of that's true. There's actually long ledge notes and arcane memos written to the effect of, we've tried this and we've tried this, and the limitation here and the limitation here impels us in another direction. But I would say at this point, to conclude this part of the presentation, the way forward, if I understand the SISI correctly, is for the DNI, because Hoover's been dead now 52 years, right? And now the DNI has her fingerprints all over it through the NCSC, for the DNI to sit down and strike the right balance between, in the counterintelligence community, what is offensive and strategic, what is defensive and in our own backyard, and what's the right balance in the national security interest and what best serves the president and his national security team.
Maybe very briefly, you could preview what you're going to talk about in your counterintelligence series coming up.
I am. So there's a couple things we've identified here. As I said in passing a few minutes ago, for all the people we talked to, there was no common understanding about what counterintelligence on the street looks like. When you tell people, there's basically 3 tools we have. There's not 4, there's not 1, there's 3 tools, and we apply them aggressively. There's physical surveillance, on the ground and in the air surveillance. There's wiretaps. If it's for a national security purpose, it will be granted, the order will be granted by the FISA court, right? And then there's networks of human assets. That's it. Translation, analysis, technical support, those are all supporting elements to what we actually do on the street against the trained intelligence officer. That's the person, man or woman, trained at their version of the farm, their version of Quantico, trained to work against U.S. interests around the world, right? So, of those, if you're talking about counterintelligence as counterespionage, the long pole in the tent is FISA. You've never seen a big case the Bureau's ever made where you haven't had FISA. If it's a big case, I'll guarantee you there's a wiretap in there somewhere. And that's by design. We do that on purpose, right? FISAs can be incredibly manpower intensive, right? But if you're going to work counterintelligence as counterespionage, then you have to address the FISA issue. Now, in my class, every semester, and I'll do it again here in an hour or so, I ask my students, because FISA, as you know, since the Carter Page FISA, has gotten a lot of attention. I was one of those who fought the declassification of the Carter Page FISA, 7 years ago now. But once they classified it, I actually called for an emergency class session here on a Saturday, 36 hours after it was published. And I brought all 423 pages in, right, to walk them through it. If they were going to declassify it, we were going to use it here at school to explain it, right? So when you ask people, what do you know about FISA, especially given the press since the Carter Page FISA, people say there's thousands of FISAs, there's tens of thousands. In reality, there's about 350 FISAs a year. That's it. Mm-hmm. There were 179 the first calendar year in 79. Steady state's about 350. It peaked in the thousands for about 10 years after 9/11 because there were a lot of counterterrorism FISAs going on. We're back down to about 350 steady state. Now, if people say, should you be saying that on a publicly available podcast? I would say yes, because the original 1978 law and all the revisions since then have required the Attorney General to make a public report to Congress every year. So every year, the Attorney General sends a letter up to the Hill and says, in the last year we've conducted X number of FISAs, and it's about 350. When you think of all the countries that have representation here in Washington, up in New York, in Chicago, in Dallas, in San Francisco, in LA, just the FISAs to cover the foreign intelligence presence in the United States get you up around 350 right off the bat. So we don't do a lot of other FISAs. FISAs are extraordinarily manpower intensive, but they become the long pole in the tent for all your counterespionage cases. The counterintelligence piece, identifying the intelligence officer, going after him or her for recruitment or running a double agent operation, that rests on physical surveillance, right? Every case officer for CIA that goes down to the farm learns, don't trust your headboard, don't trust your bathroom, don't trust your telephone. But at some point, they've got to leave the sovereign sanctity of their embassy or consulate and go out there and expose themselves and their agents on the street. And the only answer to that is surveillance. So we're going to address surveillance in one podcast, and we'll address FISA in a different, but they serve very different purposes, right? Very different purposes. FISA will help you work the U.S. person that's been recruited as a spy. Surveillance will help you work the trained intelligence officer that knows not to say anything untoward outside the skiff in his or her embassy or consulate, okay? So that's a couple things we're going to look at. Then we're going to look at the means by which this large engine of CI, which though large is still not nearly big enough, how we make choices about the balance between global offensive strategic CI and homegrown backyard counterespionage investigations. And we're going to spend a fair amount of time on that. And then there's a series of issues that kind of spin out of that to include the history of it. Like I said, the history from 47 to 78, very different than the history from 78 to 2001. And yet again, that very different from the history from 2001 to where we are now. And over that span through the semester, probably 8 or 9 sessions, we'll cover the full range.
Sounds great. I can't wait to hear that.
All right.
Okay. Well, John, I want to thank you for joining us today. You've been listening to the IWP podcast. Our guest today has been John Quattrocki, who's a professor here at IWP with a distinguished background in counterintelligence, one of the foremost experts on counterintelligence in the country. So thank you for joining us here at the IWP podcast. If you enjoyed our show, please like, rate, and spread the word. For IWP, I'm Jim Robbins. Join us next time for another edition of the IWP podcast.
Thanks, Jim.
If you like this podcast and are interested in learning more about what we talked about here today, or interested in becoming a student at IWP, visit us at iwp.edu and click Apply Now.